Welcome to Musicians versus the World, the podcast where we explore aspects of music and musician life that may not have been covered in music school. I am your host, Christine Smith. My guest today is Dr. Erin Parkes, founder and executive director of the Lotus Centre for Special Music Education. She is here to talk about her work with adaptive concerts, which are performances that are adapted for neurodivergent audiences that may respond differently to stimuli, especially music. Dr. Erin Parkes holds a Ph.D. in music education from McGill University, where she researched how to train studio music teachers to work with students with autism. In 2012, Dr. Parkes founded Lotus Centre for Special Music Education, a charitable organization committed to providing access to music education for people with exceptionalities. In addition to her role at Lotus Centre, Dr. Parkes is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, where she is also a principal researcher at the Music and Health Research Institute. Dr. Parkes presents at conferences and guest lectures internationally on teaching music to students with exceptionalities and other issues in music education. We're very fortunate to have her here with us today. So, Dr. Erin Parkes, thank you so much for being here and welcome to Musicians versus the World.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm excited to talk with you about this research that you've been doing. I think it's so wonderful to give access to people who may not have regular access or may have trouble coming to concerts. And I really just admire you for all of the work that you've been doing with this. As we start, can you maybe tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got interested in this area of research?
Mm-hmm. So my background is really as a classical pianist. So I very much come from that world. And I've been teaching for about 30 years now. I became more interested in adaptive music education really early in my teaching, probably about 20 years ago. I started to have a lot of students with different disabilities and just found that I really connected with that work. I really connected with those students and I just found that work so interesting and so different from sort of traditional approaches to music education. And it stretched me so much as a teacher and thinking totally different about music and what music is and how people experience music. And then the big catalyst for me was in 2010, which is when I was starting my PhD. My son was diagnosed with autism at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And so as a parent, that became my whole world, right? Just researching autism and understanding autism. And I started to, as I researched, see how different the processing of music is for autistic individuals. I mean, there's tons of research on it because it really is very, very different how they experience music. And at the same time, as a parent, I was seeing how difficult it was to find activities for my son because he really just couldn't engage with music concerts or lessons or anything else, martial arts or anything. It was always just fell apart. And so that's where I started to see that there are these specialized programs and services needed for these kids or even adults with disabilities to engage with these things and have equal access. And for parents and families too, to feel like this is an activity I can bring my child to that is not only going to be, something that my child can enjoy, but also that feels safe for me as a parent, because it's really, really difficult to bring our kids to concerts and be asked to leave, or for a child to have a meltdown and we know that it's disrupting the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where it all came from, is both my research and my teaching experience, but also my experience as a parent.
Yeah. So it's a very personal connection for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that is. So when you were doing this research, could you see things that were coming up in your research and you went home and you're like, oh, this is happening with my son as well?
Yeah. And more commonly the reverse.
Oh, really?
That I'd start to see things with my son and it would just, create questions for me. Like, why? Why is that happening? Or, okay, he's struggling with this. What would work better for him? And that would sort of create the research questions for me, or, my son, but also my students. I'd see, oh, okay, they're reacting differently. I'm trying this. It's not quite working. that trial and error is great, but it's also great to have the research piece of, okay, let me actually deep dive into this and see why things work or why they don't or what might work or,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it may be.
Yeah. Now, you were saying that maybe individuals with autism, they process music differently. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How do they process it differently?
Well, there's a number of different sort of perspectives on this, as there always is with research. But one of the sort of um, most interesting things about this is that in the general population of untrained musician, the incidence of absolute pitch or perfect pitch is about 1 in 10,000 people.
Hmm.
When people with autism, again, there's different research that give different numbers, but a pretty safe estimate is 1 in 20. So,
Really?
yeah. And I mean, I think at Lotus Centre, it's more like 50% because those tend to be the people that seek out music,
Yeah,
right?
well,
They
that's true. Yeah.
have affinity with it. And it's, for some of these students, it's like they live and breathe music. Like they'll listen to like a Beethoven symphony and sit down and transcribe it. Like
Mm.
it's just mind blowing sometimes. Not that everybody is like that, of course, but that's one big difference. And
Mm.
even in those that don't have absolute pitch, there are still real differences in how they perceive pitch. They can perceive smaller differences. So it can be really difficult for me as a teacher if I'm singing slightly out of tune. Sometimes I feel like that. So I do my best. But there are also sensory processing differences, and
Right.
we know this about people with autism, right? That they process their sensory world very differently. And so things like if music is too loud, that can be really challenging, or especially if there are sort of surprising sounds
Mm.
in music, or if they're listening to, several minutes of music or several pieces back to back that have a very sort of upbeat, exciting sort of affect to them that can just become overstimulating
I
after
see.
time. So all of these things too create a lot of differences in how autistic people process music. And then for those of us who are teachers or musicians, the way that we need to deliver music.
Yes, that makes sense. And that must be extremely frustrating for those people who love music and are internalizing it, but then can't go and experience it. That must
Yeah,
be just beyond frustrating for them.
absolutely. Yeah. Or when they try and it becomes really a disheartening
Yeah.
experience for them.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So now you did not come up with the idea of an adaptive concert. You said you found these programs. How did you find them?
Yeah, they've existed not that long in North America in particular. In the UK,
Mhm.
they've been around for 20 plus years, but they're sort of just seeping into North America in the last 10 plus kind of years.
Okay.
And but very small scale, right? It would be like um, an arts organization or an orchestra here
Mhm.
and there would trial some sensory friendly or adaptive concerts. And so I was the first sort of introduction that I had with it personally was I was approached by the National Arts Centre Orchestra that's based in Ottawa. And this was right when Lotus Centre started. So it was around 2012. And they realized that it was a gap in their programming, that they didn't really have accessible programming for people with disabilities. And then we came on the scene as sort of, specializing in this. And they approached us and said, we have this gap. We want to do something. What can we do? And I was aware of these concerts that they were happening, but didn't really know a lot about them because there wasn't much written about them. There aren't guidelines or anything. It was just, things that places were trying. And it was quite a lot different. We've come a long way in that time too. It was really like everything low sensory input, like lights low, everything quiet. Now we've adjusted quite a bit. It's very different. But I partnered with the NAC to put together a program that is sensory friendly chamber concerts. And they're preceded by a number of workshops led by the orchestra musicians where the participants get to play the instruments, touch the instruments, feel the vibrations or whatever's going on with the instruments, and get to know the musicians that they're then going to see in the chamber concert. So they're already engaging with this, and it becomes more comfortable for them, because one of the big differences or the challenges is newness.
Mm.
There's can be a lot of anxiety around unknowns. So if they already know the musicians, they know the instruments, they know how they're going to sound, they know what the volume is, all of that, then going to the concert is a much more relaxed
Mm.
experience for them.
Okay, so it may not be, I'm just thinking about brass instruments. Like they seem loud and they seem like they could be startling, but that's what these workshops are for, so they can get accustomed to that and kind of not desensitized. I'm not sure what I'm thinking about, but like they get comfortable and familiar with it. Is that kind of what they do, what these workshops do?
Yeah, that's it. And there's always a warning, right? We're like, I'm going to play this trumpet and it's going to sound pretty loud. So if you want to cover your ears, you can do that. Some of the participants will wear noise canceling headphones, which
Uh-huh.
is great. But usually, yes, with that they do become sort of desensitized, like that sensory input is not as jarring for them,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of it too is it's scary for them when they don't know what it will be like. But
Mm-hmm.
once they know, like, yes, it might be still loud, but the anxiety is the unknown.
Right.
So, and that sensory piece that can be challenging for them, they can just wear sensory, headphones, like noise canceling headphones. And that will help with that as long as they know and they can prepare. It helps a lot.
Gotcha. Okay. So they kind of piloted this, and then you came up with this program of these workshops, and then these adaptive concerts with this orchestra, this chamber orchestra. How did it go? Did it go well?
Yeah. Well, now we do like 12 series a year,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
workshops and followed by a concert. Yeah, they've been really, really well received. And actually now we're not keeping up with the demand, because there are
Oh my
so
goodness.
many people that want to do it. And typically we go into like schools that have special education students or day programs, or we partner with other community organizations. And they love it because it's so hands-on. Like, going to a concert is great, but they actually get to play the instruments and feel the instruments. And some of them don't want to, especially the brass, because it kind of tickles, right? So some of them don't, and I get it because I don't actually like that either. But okay, they get the opportunity, and we still try to say, like, well, look in the bell, or, experience it different ways. And that's an experience they don't often get with orchestral instruments, especially, right? And so, yeah, like the feedback has just been extraordinarily positive.
Okay. Okay. So now you said at the beginning everything was like low sensory with like the lights down. You said that's changed. So can you kind of walk me through what one of these adaptive concerts looks like and sounds like?
Yeah, so the main thing that we really focus on is number one, the environment and making sure that that's comfortable. And then number two, the programming for the concert itself. There's a lot that comes around it, but for the concert itself, those are the two main aspects. So for the environment, we really want to make sure that there's a quiet space that they can go if they need to. So a separate room
Okay.
outside of the performance hall, something like that, even if it's just a foyer that's very quiet, where there's not going to be a lot of people, somewhere that they can go if they need to. We usually try to have a fairly small space. We're usually working with, 30-ish, audience members. It's not
Yeah.
a huge group. And so usually, like if we're working at the National Arts Center, it's one of the smaller spaces. We're conscious of the acoustics in the space too, that it's not, too echoey for the participants. But also that there are different options for seating that they can sit on. We always have mats on the ground if they need to. We have space where they can just walk around the whole time if they need to do that, or dance or move, or, whatever they need to do. Because that's one of the challenges with traditional concerts is like you're in your seat and you're kind of boxed in, right? And they can't really get up, and it's sort of frowned upon to keep getting up and going in and out, or the ushers won't even let you. So giving that space to move around is really important in the environment. In the programming itself, like I said, it used to be really like keep it pretty low, keep it pretty quiet. But that is sort of a misconception. It's not that autistic people or other neurodivergent people, because it's not just autistic people that are attending these concerts. It's not that they are, universally overstimulated by things. It's that their sensory processing is different. And they can be either hypersensitive, like overly sensitive, or hyposensitive and need more sensory input. And sometimes when we see these kids or adults sort of, wanting to fidget or moving around and stuff, they're trying to give themselves the stimulation that their body is telling them that they need. And so if everything's like a low sensory environment, they're going to seek it out somehow. So they're going to need to get up and move, or they're going to need to start to fidget. But with music, we can do that. We can give them that sensory input, right? So what we're really conscious of when we're building out a program is balancing having some, higher sensory input pieces and some more relaxing pieces, some like breaks where they can move, or some that they're just listening quietly. And we try to never stay in any one sort of affect for more than 5 minutes,
Okay.
because then you can start to lose some people, or it becomes overstimulating for those that, need a little downtime. So it's really that sort of ebb and flow. And so when I'm working with musicians that are putting together these programs, a lot of it is how are we balancing that? Where do we need to insert movement? Now, again, they can get up and move whenever they want, but as much as possible, we want to build that into the program so that
Mm.
we're giving them that they always have the agency to do what they want, which is fantastic. But we're very conscious of that, so that those environment pieces and those different programming pieces are really the two big elements.
Hmm. Is there a certain genre that you find works best for these types of concerts?
No, I think we've done it in just about every genre you can imagine, and all different, like, I've only ever worked with chamber ensembles,
Uh-huh.
not full orchestras, but, pretty wide range of different ensembles, and they all work great. I don't think there's any one that's better than the others.
Mm. As long as you have that balance and work in some time to move around, and then it works really well. And then having the quiet space. Another thing I thought was really, really clever, that you said in your research, is that before the concert, you make available a visual story and almost pictures of going from the car into the room of the concert area. So that preparation begins not only for the music and the musicians, but even the venue. I think that is so wise, especially after you're saying how it's the unknown that can cause a lot of anxiety. I think that's, when I read that, I was like, oh my goodness, that is such a great detail and such a wonderful thing for things to do. Do you do that at the Lotus Center too, with these like chamber orchestras or concerts, or is that something that you just saw in your research?
No, that is something that we do, and I mean both. If you're looking for those, there's lots online now, actually, because there's like if you look up almost every major orchestra, actually, they'll have these sort of visual guides, which is fantastic. Because even if they're not doing adaptive concerts, there are disabled people coming to their concerts, and they're recognizing that this is an important piece for them. But yes, we do have these visual guides because they are really important. And even, if we're working with groups and it's like they're going to take the bus, well, where's the bus stop and where do you get in from there? Or if you're going to park, where's your entrance there? Because I don't know, even for me, when I'm going to a new concert hall and I don't know where am I going to park and how do I get in there, it's anxiety provoking for me. So I can only imagine, people that really struggle with that, it helps them a lot to be like, this is what it's going to look like. You go here, here's where the washrooms are, here's where the stairs are and the elevators. And, it really takes that load off.
Hmm. And I can imagine, just going to a concert's a new experience anyway, and you don't want to have that anxiety even before you get into the concert hall. So anything you can take that anxiety away, I just think is so smart. It's so, so beautiful. So the question I have is, why should musicians or other orchestras or chamber groups, why should we even bother putting these concerts on? You know what I mean? Like, what's the benefit for musicians to do this?
I mean, the benefit for society is obvious, right? Like, I
Right.
mean, it provides accessibility to a whole group of people. But for musicians too, it's, because we've been doing some research with musicians as well and their experience of this. And it's also been universally positive, not only because it's really meaningful for them usually to have this experience, but they find they learn so much that then is applicable to all their performances. Like very often when we do training or, musicians participate, they're like, well, I could do these in all my children's concerts or, like it doesn't have to be for this. So it's a lot of new skills and it's, if you think about these things, a lot of them would benefit a lot of us, right? Space to move. Like
Yeah.
that would be pretty great if we could just get up and stand up if we wanted to, or go, stand on the side and stretch or whatever, like just having a more relaxed environment. So I think even if you don't incorporate these things, it just creates a lot of opportunity for reflection on what does it look like to be a performing musician and what kind of environment am I creating? And it doesn't have to be, I'm doing, accessible concerts, so they look like this, but everything else still looks like this.
Mm.
Right? And so it does create a lot of thinking about, oh, well, how can I incorporate this? I think that would be good for everybody, which is really valuable.
Mm-hmm. I love the idea of these concerts and making them accessible for everybody. But as you're talking about it, it seems like I feel like I would be not qualified to put together something like this. Is there some sort of training or is there some sort of resources for musicians that want to put on a concert like this and reach out to this population?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we put together with the NAC Orchestra is a whole series for musicians or arts organizations that want to, either do their own thing or replicate the music circle program that we've done there. So there's a guidebook that really details everything that we do and why we do it too,
Mm-hmm.
and a series of videos that explain all these different aspects. But on top of that, like for pretty much every arts organization or orchestra that I know of that is doing this work, they're partnering with somebody local that can facilitate it for them. So often it's a music therapist that they can have, actually at the venue, because even if you do these other trainings, it's really great to have someone there that can look around and say, that's not going to work. We should bring this in, because the environment is so important. And to facilitate things as they come up, because I think particularly when I started doing this work with musicians and they'd never done it, what they found really helpful was me being there and saying, that's how you handle this. That's how you handle this. Because there can't be training that's going to bring up every possible scenario, right? So that I think is a really crucial piece, is to find someone in the community that you can partner with. So music therapists, often occupational therapists are a really great resource for this as well. But that really is important in just developing the practice if you haven't ever done it before.
Mm-hmm. Is there something in these performances that may surprise a musician that they would not expect to happen?
Yeah, one thing that we get asked a lot by musicians is, are they going to come up and touch my instruments? And I mean, probably they're going to try, because a lot of these audience members don't have the same filters, right? They're not telling themselves, oh, it's not good etiquette for me to go up. They just see a cool instrument. And like, I want to touch that. They're playing it. It sounds great. I want to play it. And I mean, we always have sort of some guidelines around that, because even if the musicians are comfortable with showing their instruments after, like sometimes we kind of have an instrument petting zoo and that's the opportunity to try it. Most are not comfortable with audience members doing that during the performance,
Yeah, I
right?
could see that. I could see that.
So if it's not on like a raised stage, because often in these smaller halls, it's not, we will often just do something even really simple, like mark it off with tape. So it just creates a visual. And then we say, you cannot cross this line. And actually, then they almost never do. You just have to set up that boundary. The visual is important. You don't cross this line. And then usually we'll set up, like if we are going to do mats on the floor or something, they'll all be outside of that. So that also creates another visual of like, this is as close as you're getting. So that's a big thing that sometimes musicians are worried about. I think they're also surprised often by the amount of noise that these audience members will generate sometimes because they'll vocalize or they'll make noise if they're excited. And there's nothing wrong with that. And all the musicians that do these concerts kind of signed up for a freer environment, right?
Uh-huh.
But they don't know what it's going to look like. And so I think that's one of the big things is the way that, when you're so used to performing for audience members that are totally silent
Right.
most of the time, the amount of noise, it can sometimes be a little surprising, but they usually love it. They
Yeah.
love that interaction and hearing that enthusiasm from the audience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so. I think it's probably a nice change for them, really. I mean, you can get more interaction, you get a little bit more, give and take from a louder audience than a silent one sometimes. So
Yeah. And it's part of that, like, learning different ways of being in a concert, right? It doesn't have to be silent. Why does it need to be silent? Like there's nothing wrong with having a more interactive sort of performance. And sometimes they use it. If they hear something, they incorporate it somehow or they, work off of it. So,
you'll have to explain that a little bit more. What do you mean they use it or incorporate it?
so sometimes, if audience members are like making, certain sounds or something, then that can be something that they can incorporate into um, like an improvisation section of their piece, or like even sometimes we have like little movement breaks in between where they are improvising and kids are moving along with it, but it can be like instead of like body percussion or something, it can be these vocalizations that are being sort of incorporated, or it can be body percussion because a lot of kids might do that too. Or it could be certain movements that they're doing that it's like, let's all do that movement to the music. So that also acknowledges that the contribution of those audience members is also part of everything that's happening here, right? It's not just musicians as performers and everybody else just watching and taking it in. It's all of us together, sort of part of this experience.
Yeah. And that's such a beautiful thing. I would think, especially for children who feel like they're on the outside a lot, to be brought in like that must be so meaningful for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do the parents just like leave in tears because they're so happy?
They often literally are in tears.
I can imagine.
Yeah. It's such a relief for them to not have to worry. Like, I really can't tell you how heavy that is to have to worry every time you go somewhere with your child that you have to restrict their joy, really, because that's what it is they're just being joyful. But that other people might sort of look at it like it's weird or frown upon it, and you have to like bring it down for other people's sake, especially in a concert environment.
Yeah.
And it's so great to just let them have that joy, or even if it's not joy and they're upset, that's okay too. And everybody there is going to understand if you need to go and take a break or, whatever is happening. But also for the parents, like aside from the relief just that they can be here, to watch their child who loves music actually really be able to engage with it and see live musicians and experience that is often something they never thought would be possible. So yes, often, I mean, I cried the first time I went with my child too. And it was like, wow, and yeah, it happens pretty often.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. So what do you think, and you said it's growing in America. in Canada and the US. So where is the future? What does the future hold for these concerts?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's growing like exponentially, which is so fantastic because when we started this in 2012, there weren't a lot of examples
Right.
for us to build from. We kind of just like built it from scratch. Like I said, like all that existed was these sort of low sensory concerts, and there weren't that many. And now there are so many, and so many organizations are doing really cool things, putting their own spins on it. I think there are two main aspects that still have a lot of room other than just continuing to grow, which is great. One is research.
Mhm.
There's hardly anything out there really looking at what works and
Hmm.
what doesn't, and what is the experience of the musicians and the audience members and the caregivers. And the other is training for the artists. Often they're coming into these kind of cold, which can be intimidating.
Yeah.
So, that sort of training and mentorship for the artists, um, there's a lot of room for more of that to develop.
Hmm. And you're doing some of that, right? We've got the Xenia concerts, and then you're coming up with some open education for artists. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yeah, so I work with an organization called Xenia Concerts, which is a Toronto-based organization, and their entire mandate is to provide accessible adaptive concerts. That's all the work that they do. And so I partnered with their executive director, Rory McLeod, to develop an artist training program that includes a number of webinars and a guidebook for all of their new musicians that are going to present Xenia concerts. They all go through this training, and then we have a 1 hour discussion session with them where they can ask any questions they may have about the material, but also work through it with their program, what it's going to look like, and bounce ideas off of us. And that's also sort of snowballed into a research project because we've collected questionnaires from them, some data after they do their training. And we've had about 30 musicians do it now, or more than 30 musicians do the training, but 30 fill out the survey. And we were like, wow, this is really great data that actually should be shared because there's nothing. There's
Yeah.
nothing on this. It's a first of its kind training program. And so there's obviously no research out there on it because it hasn't happened before. So right now we're working on collecting and analyzing that data for publication. We have presented it at some conferences, but also it's sort of been a pilot to do this through Xenia. It's just been with their artists. But it would be great to see that, available more widely.
So
The other,
when
oh, sorry,
Oh,
go
so
ahead.
I just had one follow-up question. So when you have this research and you're going to publish it, is that research going to be used to increase funding or for more common practices for people? What's like the end goal for the research that you're conducting?
I mean, in terms of funding, really just collecting the information is fine. We don't need to like analyze it like researchers and publish it. Funders are just happy to see
Yeah.
uh, there and people are, benefiting. The publishing it as research is really just to get it out there in the research world because there is nothing happening there. And I think that's
Uh-huh.
an important piece. So I've already published, other papers on this and spoken at a number of conferences because it's not on people's radar in terms
Okay.
of research yet, even though it's happening a lot in practice. And
Gotcha.
when it's happening in practice, we're all sort of like, I think this works. It seems to be working. But what we want to do with the research is say, yes, this is working, or this piece isn't, or you know what, we should adjust this.
Okay.
And research helps us improve our practice.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Great. Thanks. And then I'm sorry, I completely interrupted you. What were you going to say after that?
Oh, that's okay. So the other piece that I'm working on with a colleague, Jenna Richards at Chamberfest, is an open educational resource that will be a series of training modules for musicians that want to do this kind of concert as well. And we're doing that with funding from the University of Ottawa, and it will be open access.
That's
So
amazing.
musicians that want to do this that are not necessarily doing it with an organization where they're already providing a lot of training and mentorship can seek this out, and it will be something that they can use.
Oh, perfect. Do you have kind of a timeline about when that's going to be available for people?
It should be in the next year.
Oh, okay. Great. So where will musicians be able to find it?
That will be available. I mean, it's through the University of Ottawa library, but I think it will be connected with other university open access libraries. But I
Okay.
I don't actually know how that whole library system works, but it will be available through open access in about a year.
Okay. Well, I hope that you'll reach out to us and once it's available and we can kind of get the word out so that musicians can have access to that and can find it. Well, it's been so enlightening and so eye-opening for me. I just appreciate you coming and chatting. Is there any last minute, I guess, advice for musicians or maybe those that care for people with sensory issues or neurodivergent people, like anything, or just words of encouragement or anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to say just kind of as a final words in our conversation?
I think what I would encourage musicians and arts organizations to do is to not feel like this has to be a standalone activity. That's fantastic. It's great because then everything you're doing is adapted to these audiences. But to maybe just offer these opportunities as relaxed performances that anybody that can attend that would benefit. Because there are a lot of people with different sensory processing or that would just like a more relaxed environment and doing things like the visual guides, just having those widely available, having concerts where people can move around. It doesn't have to be every concert. But if you're not yet ready to do like a full adaptive concert with everything that means, that's okay. You can incorporate bits of it and it will still be making things more accessible to a much wider audience.
I love that. I think that's great. Thank you, Dr. Parkes. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing for this research and for really just pushing along these ideas of adaptive concerts and making music available for everybody. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for coming and talking with me today.
My pleasure.